Okay, good morning everybody. My name is Jonathan Teale and I'm your host for this Legislation Service Update Service webinar. This webinar is looking at recent changes and updates in health and safety legislation and guidance. We're running another webinar on Friday next week when my colleague Ellie Golston will be looking at environmental law, but today I'm just looking at health and safety law. Okay, so just a couple of words before I start going through the slides, just a couple of words about myself. So I'm one of a number of EHS consultants working for Legislation Update Service and the compliance people. I've been in health and safety consultancy for over 17 years now, and more recently I've become involved in environmental consultancy as well. I conduct EHS audits for clients all over the country in all sectors. So if you instruct us to carry out an audit for you, it could be myself that comes to your site. So just a few words about the software before I start going through the legal changes. So we're using Zoom software. The software automatically mutes any microphone and webcam you have in your device. So that means you can't ask any questions verbally and I won't be able to hear you. So that also means you don't need to worry about any sound or anything happening at your end interfering with the webinar. So neither I nor anybody else attending the webinar can see or hear any delegates. There is a facility, however, for asking questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a tab which says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type a question and submit it to us for consideration. If we can answer the question straight away, we'll do so, as we have other consultants here who will be trying to answer those straight away. Otherwise, we'll ensure that all of the questions and answers are sent out to everybody. By the way, any questions and answers that are raised are, well, basically, we can see the names of the people who raised the questions unless you tick the send anonymously box. Now, obviously, there's no such thing as a stupid question, but if you want to ask your question anonymously, you can do so by ticking the send anonymously button. So at the end of the webinar, we'll send you a link so that you can download both the audio and the slides, and of course you'll also see the questions and answers. So let's look at the changes in health and safety law over the past 12 months. So I'm going to start by saying there's been absolutely no new non-Brexit related health and safety law at all in the last 12 months. So what there has been is a number of changes in health and safety guidance, so I will go through those. And then there have been a lot of updates to existing legislation almost entirely related to Brexit. So some of these changes are administrative only with no effect on the duties of organisations. Some of the changes, however, may affect certain businesses involved in certain areas, in particular in the manufacture or supply of certain goods or products. So the majority of this webinar is going to be looking at how those Brexit-related changes will work. So firstly, let's look at the changes to Hse Guidance. So perhaps the most significant change is in relation to mild steel welding fume. So mild steel is a form of steel that has a low carbon content, and current research shows that exposure to mild steel welding fume is carcinogenic. So for that reason, the Hse has revised their enforcement approach in relation to that. So what they are now saying is that regardless of the duration of any mild steel welding, you must provide suitable controls. So that's going to mean either providing some sort of LEV or respiratory protection or both. So you can no longer say that if the welding is very short duration, it's only short duration, so we didn't provide any controls. So note, this isn't a change in the law because the Clp regulations in a sense already cover this. So this is just a change in the Hse's enforcement approach and guidance. The Hse has also issued a new guidance document, INDG 479, on fit testing. So this is in relation to respiratory protective equipment. So if you provide for your employees any type of respiratory protective equipment as a mandatory control to protect their health, then you must do face fit testing. So this is not a new legal requirement, this has always been there, but what is new is this Hse guidance in relation to how you do face fit testing. Now, if you only provide, say, nuisance dust masks and they are voluntary, so you don't require your employees to wear them, then you don't have to do face fit testing. Okay, so next, hand-arm vibration. So the HSE's guidance document L140, they have issued a second edition of this. Now, unlike the previous guidance documents, for this revised guidance document, in reality, there is no change. So all that's happened here is that there was some technical changes made to the regulations, to some references and so on, which meant that the guidance then had incorrect references in, so they have basically updated that guidance so that it's technically correct. But in fact, there is no new requirement, no new approach that you need to take in relation to controlling vibration. What they have also done is issued an exposure calculator. So this is a tool, it's a voluntary tool, you don't have to use it, but it's a useful tool. And it allows you to calculate the overall vibration exposure for any individual employee. So it's particularly useful if you have employees who use a number of different types of equipment for different lengths of time and with different exposure levels. So basically what you need to know in order to use the tool is how long does the employee use each piece of equipment for, and what is the exposure value for that equipment. And you then put those details into the tool and it adds them all up, and it will then tell you whether or not that employee is being exposed to vibration above the relevant legal limits or not. So the other document which the HSE has issued is INDG 480, which is hand-arm vibration in amenity horticulture. So this is going to be relevant to anybody whose employees are regularly using horticultural equipment such as trimmers and chainsaws and mowers and so on. Okay, so the HSE has also updated the manual handling assessment chart. This is commonly known as the MAC tool. So the MAC tool is a tool for assessing the risk for specific manual handling tasks, and it asks a whole series of questions such as how heavy is the load, how big is the load, how easy is it to handle, are you lifting it from waist height or above head height or off the floor, what's the environment that you're carrying it through, and so on. Now they've made some minor changes to this tool. So there's a couple of revised questions. So I think in particular, whereas they used to simply say, are you lifting the load from knee height or below, they now separate it out as, are you lifting it from below knee height or are you lifting it off the floor? I think there's also some minor revisions to guidance, such as where you've got 2 or more people lifting a load. Now, it's not a major change, so it doesn't mean that any risk assessments that you've done using the previous version of the MAC tool are invalid. But all I would do is if you do use the MAC tool, then for any future assessments, you'll want to make sure you've got the most up-to-date version, which was issued in March last year. And then there is also a new document issued by the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, which also came out in March, well, rather it was reissued in March last year. So this is in relation to management and operation of microbiological containment laboratories. So it's relevant to any labs that operate at containment levels 2 or 3. So 2 or 3 are basically where you're dealing with potentially infectious materials. Level 4 is kind of very high risk, sort of port and down type stuff. And level 1 is where there's basically no risk. So this is only really relevant where you have a containment level 2 or 3 laboratory. Now this document, I've got to be honest, it's about 120 pages long. And it doesn't tell you at the front why they've reissued it. And I'll be honest, I wasn't particularly familiar with the previous version either, so I can't see exactly what they've changed or why they've reissued it. But if you do operate a containment level 2 or 3 lab, then you'll obviously want to have a look at this. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the amendments to legislation. So, as I said before, all of the changes that we've had in health and safety law over the last 12 months have been entirely related to Brexit. So there have been multiple administrative changes. So I'm going to go through what all of this means, but the administrative changes tend to be changes to terminology, references, and so on, without necessarily changing duties. And primarily, the objective of all of these changes has actually been to ensure consistency in the legal requirements and to avoid any dramatic changes. So the purpose is really to ensure that the legal requirements continue to operate in the same way. All of these changes do not come into effect until exit day, which currently is going to be the 31st of January. And all of these changes assume that the UK leaves the EU without a deal. So all of this was part of the no deal planning carried out by the government. Now, having said that, if we leave the EU with a transition deal, which now looks very likely given the change in government, then all of the changes that I'm going to be talking about will then be postponed until the end of the transition period. So you'll see in the slides, I talk about changes coming into effect on exit day, and that's because currently that's what these regulations say, and exit day is the 31st of January this year. But the transition deal bill, which is currently going through Parliament, provides that all of these changes would then be postponed until the end of the transition period. So that will be called implementation period completion day. So just be aware that all of these changes are actually probably not going to take effect until at least the 31st of December this year. So what sort of types of law are we looking at? So firstly, we have a lot of UK Acts of Parliament and regulations which cover health and safety. And in the whole, there's been no change in duties to these, but there have been multiple administrative changes in reference and terminology and so on, which I'll come on to. However, UK regulations relating to CE marking, there have been a number of changes here which will potentially change some duties. So primarily what has happened here, or rather what will happen here, is that CE marking will be replaced by a UK equivalent called UK marking. And I'm going to go through what that means. Then we have the EU regulations, which are directly applicable in the UK. So these are, for example, REACH, which applies to chemical manufacturers and importers. So all of those EU regulations are duplicated onto the UK statute book on exit day, but they often will also have multiple changes in terminology and amendments in relation to enforcement and so on. And where we then copy those EU regulations onto the UK statute book, they then become referred to as retained EU legislation, because obviously we retain them within our own legal framework. And then finally, we have EU directives. So EU directives are issued by the European Union, and they go to member states, and they require member state governments to implement national law in order to put certain requirements into effect. So they're not technically binding on businesses. However, a lot of UK legislation makes references to directives. So for example, you'll often find things like annexes and schedules in directives that set out, for example, exposure limits. And UK legislation will often make reference to those annexes. So for that reason, EU directives, although they're not binding on businesses, they are often relevant. And for that reason, we will continue to keep them within legislation update service. And you'll also start to see, if you ever go onto the HM government website, which sets out all of the legislation, so it used to be called HMSO, you'll see that in fact they've also started to put EU regulations and directives into that website. So I mentioned administrative changes, so let's have a look first at what some of these mean. So there have been a lot of administrative changes. So you will have seen in your monthly updates to LUS a lot of these Brexit related changes coming through. So the changes generally don't affect any of the duties. They don't affect anything that you have to do as a business. And examples of the changes include things like some of the powers that were previously exercised by the European Commission are transferred to the Secretary of State. So the amendment set that out. The scope of the regulations is expressly restricted to the UK, whereas previously, obviously, they could have applied anywhere within the EU. And where regulations contain references to EU directives, in some cases, these are changed to references to UK legislation. In other cases, as I was saying before, we continue to retain references to EU directives. So that's going to be the bulk of the changes that you will see, which don't affect you. But I'm now going to look at Brexit changes relating to CE marking. So currently, Conformity Assessment and CE marking across the European Union ensures that certain goods sold within the EU conform to minimum safety standards. So that's obviously the purpose of it. And CE marking is implemented in the UK primarily through UK regulations by, for example, the Electrical Equipment Safety Regulations 2016. Sometimes they're implemented through EU regulations. So, for example, EU Regulation 2016-425 on personal protective equipment. So the primary Brexit change to this is that since the UK will no longer be part of the CE marking system, but because we also want to maintain the same standards, we will therefore introduce a UK equivalent scheme, which will be called UK marking rather than CE marking. So in effect, the changes to the regulations change a number of the terms and introduce this term UK marking. So the standards that we manufacture to will be the same, but as I say, we'll be referring to UK marking. So in these next two slides, I'm just going to show you some of the regulations that are affected by these CE marking changes. Now, as I go through them, what I'm going to stress here is that all of these regulations apply to manufacturers and suppliers of these types of goods. They don't relate to the users. So if you are simply a user of the type of equipment that I'm looking at, then none of these changes is going to be relevant to you. So firstly, we have the Electrical Equipment Safety Regs and the Electromagnetic Compatibility Regs. So they both apply to general electrical equipment. We then have the Simple Pressure Vessel Safety Regs and the Pressure Equipment Safety Regs. And they both apply, obviously, to pressure vessels and pressure equipment. The lifts regulations apply to personnel lifts. The equipment and protective systems intended for use in potentially explosive atmospheres regulations. Now, they apply to ATEX rated equipment. So that's equipment that's designed specifically to be safe in an explosive atmosphere. Then we have the noise emission in the environment by equipment for use outdoors regulations. So they apply to pretty much any type of equipment that you might use outdoor that makes noise. So that can range from forklift trucks to ride-on mowers to strimmers to chainsaws and so on. And the object of those regulations is to ensure that all of those types of equipment don't emit too much noise. Then we have the General Product Safety Regulations. So they apply to general consumer products which are not covered in any of these other regulations. The Supply of Machinery Safety Regulations obviously apply to machinery. The Aerosol Dispensers Regulations apply to aerosol cans. Now the Explosives Regulations, now they apply not only to manufacturers and distributors of explosives, but they do actually also, in this case, apply to users of explosives. However, the Brexit related changes, which cover CE marking, only apply to manufacturers and suppliers. So again, if you are a simple user of explosives, not a manufacturer, then these CE marking changes won't affect you. Then we have the Regulation 2016-425 on personal protective equipment and the Personal Protective Equipment Enforcement Regulations. So they apply to manufacturers and suppliers of PPE. I'm just going to make a side note about these, and that is that like all of these other regulations, they only apply to manufacturers and suppliers. And we do see that quite a lot of clients put these regulations into their registers. Now, if you are only supplying PPE to your own employees rather than supplying them commercially to customers, then these regulations don't apply to you. So you don't actually need them in your register. And then the same applies to these last two regulations. So we have Regulation 2016-426 on appliances burning gaseous fuels and the Gas Appliances Enforcement and Miscellaneous Amendments regulations. So they apply to people that make gas-fired equipment such as cookers, boilers, and heaters. So the CE marking changes, the key changes are, firstly, CE marking will be replaced by UK marking. And that's what the UK mark is going to look like. So we then have some changes in terminology. So whereas currently we refer to an EU declaration of conformity, that will simply become a declaration of conformity. And where we previously or currently have the EU type examination, that will become just type examination. And then harmonized standards will be replaced by designated standards. So a harmonized standard is a standard that's developed by a recognized European standards body and then effectively approved by the European Union as being the standard to which goods must be manufactured. So since we will no longer be part of that system, we will replace harmonized standards with designated standards, and those will be standards designated by the Secretary of State. Now, in reality, the Secretary of State, at least in the short to medium term, will simply be designating the exact same standards that are currently adopted as harmonized standards. So we don't expect, at least in the short term, any change to those standards. They will be the exact same standards. It's just that we will be referring to them as designated standards. And then in many cases, the regulations are also amended to provide detail about how the Secretary of State will go about designating standards. So we then have changes in relation to notified bodies. So a notified, well, currently, if you want to carry out a conformity assessment, you can have that carried out either you do it yourself as the manufacturer, or you have it done by a notified body. So a notified body is an independent conformity assessment body which has been notified by a member state to the European Commission and is then recognised across all of the other member states. So the change that we will have is that UK-based notified bodies will no longer be recognised in the EU as notified bodies. So we therefore replace we replace notified bodies with UK approved bodies. So the amended UK regulations introduce this equivalent approved body scheme. Now note that any EU notified body, and this obviously includes a UK notified body, will automatically become an approved body under the UK regime. So in other words, in the UK, we will continue to recognise any notified body as an approved body, but conversely, a UK-based notified body will not be recognised in the European Union as a notified body after exit day. I'm just going to say again, of course, that change will almost certainly be postponed to the end of the transition period. So although I say after exit day, it will probably be actually at the end of the transition period. So now this is a really important point here. UK continued recognition of CE marked goods. So all of these CE marking regulations, although they introduce this UK CA marking scheme, they also provide that CE marked goods will continue to be recognised in the UK for the time being. And at the moment, there is no long stop deadline set on that. So that will mean that at least for the time being, UK manufacturers and importers can choose whether or not they're going to switch over to the UK marking scheme or whether they're going to stay with CE marking. Now, in the long term, it's likely that we will not continue necessarily to recognise CE marked goods. So it may well be that you would have, in the long term, you would have to change to UK marking. But at least in the short term, there's no urgency with needing to switch to UK marking. So what about if you're exporting CE marked goods? So if you have goods which you've manufactured and you've already placed them on the market and they've already been CE marked, then they will continue to be recognised in the EU even after exit day. On the other hand, if you have goods which you're currently developing and you haven't yet placed them on the market, then this is what will happen. So if you carry out the CE marking and conformity assessment yourself as a manufacturer and place them on the market, then they will be recognized. And the reason for that is that that's the system that the EU already has. So in the same way, manufacturers, for example, in the United States or China or Brazil or anywhere else outside the EU can CE mark goods legitimately and place them on the EU market, and we will be in the same position. On the other hand, as I was saying before, if you are planning to get goods conformity assessment by a UK-based notified body, you would no longer be able to place those goods on the EU market. So what options do you have? So one is to get the goods reassessed by an EU-based notified body. Alternatively, you can transfer the technical files to an EU-based notified body. Or it's probably worth finding out whether the UK-based notified body, which you currently use, is planning to take whatever action it needs to be recognised in the EU. So in some cases, notified bodies are moving their registered office or becoming part of an EU-based notified body so that they can continue to carry out conformity assessments that will be recognised in the EU. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to EU regulations. So these are regulations which are issued by the European Commission, but which are directly enforceable in the UK. And we have quite a number of these. So I've just put a few examples on here, but there are others. So probably the most significant of all of them is REACH, which applies to manufacturers and importers of chemicals. Then we have CLP, which stands for Classification, Labelling and Packaging. So that also applies to manufacturers and distributors of chemicals. Then we have the EU regulation on biocidal products. So this applies to you if you're making things like bleach. Then we have the regulation that I've mentioned before on personal protective equipment, which relates to manufacture and supply of PPE. And then we have the regulation on appliances burning gaseous fuels, so boilers and cookers and so on. And we have the regulation on construction products. So that obviously applies if you make and supply construction products. So what the European Union Withdrawal Act says is that on exit day, all of those already enforceable EU regulations are copied into UK law and they become part of UK legislation. So that means that on that day, or potentially at the end of the transition period, all of those regulations will be duplicated not only into the UK statute book, but obviously also into legislation update service. So whereas at the moment you may only have you will only have one copy of things like REACH and CLP and so on, you will notice that we create a duplicate and we make it clear whether you're looking at the EU version or the UK version. And the UK version is going to be referred to as the UK retained version. So those UK retained versions are then subject to multiple amendments. And they are a little bit like the changes that we had to the UK regulations. They are changes that do things like changing EU references to UK references, limiting the scope to the UK, and providing for enforcement by UK regulators. So currently, if you have something like REACH in your register, and if you go into the amendment section, you will see multiple text in there relating to Brexit-related amendments. And that's because currently, of course, that's the only place where we can put it. But once we have a UK retained version on the UK statute book, and we create that duplicate in LUS, what we will do is move all of the text about Brexit-related amendments from the EU version of the regulation, and we will move it across into the UK version. So you will then need to keep track whether or not you're looking at the EU version or the UK version. Now, obviously, if you're supplying goods into the EU, then you would want to keep the EU version as well. If you're only supplying goods into the UK, then it may be that you would decide at that point that you didn't need to keep the EU version and that you only needed the UK version. So I'm going to look at a few of these regulations and what the actual implications are on those specific regulations. So I'm going to start with REACH. So obviously, as I was saying, the UK version of REACH is copied onto the UK statute book. There are multiple amendments that limit the effect of UK REACH to the UK. And where functions were previously performed by the European Chemicals Agency, they will be performed by the Health and Safety Executive. So there are a lot of amendments that say replace the words European Chemicals Agency with Health and Safety Executive. And then the Secretary of State will perform a lot of functions of the European Commission. So again, there are a lot of technical changes that basically say replace the words European Commission with the Secretary of State. So if you are making new chemicals in the future which haven't yet gone on the market, then post-exit, you would need to register those with the Health and Safety Executive rather than with the European Chemicals Agency. If you have chemicals that are already registered with the European Chemicals Agency, then those registrations after exit or after the transition period will no longer be recognised by the European Chemicals Agency, so they will in effect become void. However, those existing registrations with the European Chemicals Agency will be automatically copied direct into the UK system. So what that will mean is that manufacturers don't need to re-register chemicals that they've already registered because the HSE will therefore have a copy of them. Now, although you won't need to re-register them, because the HSE won't necessarily be able to get all of the information they need about them from the European Chemicals Agency, there will be a legal requirement to file certain information with the HSE. And that requirement will initially be to file certain limited information within 60 days, and that will be within 60 days either of exit day if we leave with no deal, or 60 days after the end of the transition period, assuming that the transition period goes through. And you will then have a further 2 years after which you would have to provide further detailed information. So what about if you're importing chemicals from outside the UK? So currently, if you're importing chemicals from another European Union country, then you don't need to register any chemicals that you're importing. And that's likely to continue to be the case until the end of the transition period. Obviously, if you're importing chemicals from outside the European Union, then you already have an obligation, assuming you're importing more than a ton, that is, you have an obligation to register those chemicals with the European Chemicals Agency. Post-exit, you will be required to register any chemical that you're importing from outside the UK if you're importing more than 1 ton of it. So as I was saying, if you're importing it from outside the EU, then that's already the case. So the only change would be that you'd be registering with the HSE rather than with the European Chemicals Agency. But note that in the long term, if you're going to be importing a chemical from another European member state in quantities exceeding 1 ton, whereas currently you don't have any registration requirements, you will then have a registration requirement. So if, for example, you're importing it, say, from a sister site in France, then potentially you will become an importer and you will have a registration requirement. However, there is a kind of transition to this requirement, and that is that if you're importing from an EU-based supplier or distributor or manufacturer, and that supplier or distributor or manufacturer has already registered that chemical with the European Chemicals Agency, then you won't be required to register that chemical with the HSE within the first 2 years after exit day, although you would still have to supply certain other information to the Health and Safety Executive within 180 days. So what about substances of very high concern? So these are the substances that the European Union lists as being of particular concern. So they tend to be things like carcinogens and mutagens. So we're not talking here about things that are particularly caustic or acidic or flammable. We're talking about chemicals that are serious health risks and are therefore listed as substances of very high concern. So currently, the European Chemicals Agency issues these 3 lists. So we have the authorization list, which states that if you use certain chemicals in a particular way, then you have to apply for authorization to do that. And then we have the candidate list, which is a list of further substances that the European Union is considering adding to the authorization list. And then we have the restriction list, which lists certain chemicals and states that if you use them in a certain way, they are subject to certain restrictions. So, for example, there are certain chemicals on the restriction list which states that if you put them into paints or varnishes, they can't comprise, say, more than 0.5% of the paint or varnish. So under UK REACH, the HSE will recreate the candidate list, authorization list, and restriction list. And again, initially, we would expect those lists to mirror the EU lists. Now, it may be that in the long term, in the future, we will see divergence where our lists become slightly different to the European lists, but at least in the short term, we would expect them to be identical. If you are currently a UK-based authorized user, or if you are a downstream user that benefits from an authorization granted to your supplier, then following exit or following the end of the transition period, that authorization would no longer be recognized within the EU. However, that authorization will also be copied across to the UK system. So that again means that you wouldn't need to reapply for authorization within the EU, but you will be required to file certain information to the HSE within 60 days. And again, that's within 60 days, either of exit day or the end of the transition period. If you currently have an application that is waiting with the European Chemicals Agency for consideration, then the application will be transferred to the HSE and decided within 6 months of that date. And one other change that you may note if you read through all of the changes in detail is that in relation to the restriction list, in effect, the restriction list isn't changed at all, with the exception of in relation to asbestos products. So the restriction in relation to asbestos products is removed. Now that might look as though what we're doing is relaxing our standards in relation to asbestos products. We're not. The only reason that the restriction list will be changed there is simply because UK regulations already completely prohibit the use of asbestos in any products. So for that reason, we don't need to have that line in the restriction list about asbestos, whereas in some EU member states, asbestos is not completely prohibited. So that's the only reason that we've removed, or rather we will remove that restriction, is because it's already completely prohibited. Okay, so next I'm going to look at the CLP regulation. So this is the regulation that applies to classification, labeling and packaging. So this applies to anybody who is manufacturing or supplying chemicals. So again, a UK version of CLP will be duplicated onto the UK statute book. The scope of CLP within the UK will obviously be restricted to the UK. And again, the HSE will perform the same functions within the UK that the European Chemicals Agency performs in the EU. And the Secretary of State will perform the same functions of the European Commission. So again, if you go into the CLP regulation on LUS and you look in the amendment section, you'll see a fairly long section setting out all of the amendments. A lot of the changes are related to these kinds of administrative changes. So the basic requirements under CLP will be unchanged. So in other words, if you are a manufacturer or supplier of chemicals and they're hazardous, you'll still need to classify them. You'll still need to apply the same types of labeling, and you'll still have the same packaging requirements. But the changes are, firstly, if you're importing chemicals from another EU country, you will become an importer. And that means that whereas currently, let's say you're importing some chemicals from France, if you are only the importer, you don't necessarily have any duties under CLP. Whereas post-exit or post-transition period, because you will then be importing into the UK, you will then have the duties that CLP sets out. So currently the EU has a classification and labelling inventory onto which hazardous chemicals have to be registered, managed by the European Chemicals Agency. So that classification and labelling inventory will be duplicated in the UK, but renamed as the UK Notification Database. So where you see that term UK Notification Database, it's the UK version of the classification and labelling inventory. So the HSE will also develop a UK mandatory classification and labelling list, and that is a list that will list all of the new substances that the UK is considering adding to the UK notification database. So a little bit confusing there. So whereas the EU has the classification and labelling inventory, which is chemicals that already need to be on that inventory, we're calling our version the UK notification and the UK notification database. And the separate UK classification and labelling list is going to be a list of chemicals that we're thinking of adding to the database. So the Clp Regulation UK version is also amended to provide that the HSE or a manufacturer or an importer or a downstream user can submit an application to the HSE to revise the classification and labelling requirements for a particular chemical. So next I'm going to look at the Biocidal Products Regulation. So this applies to organisations that manufacture and supply basically products such as bleach, anything that's designed basically to kill bugs. So again, a UK version of the Biocidal Products Regulation will be copied onto the UK statute book. Again, the scope will be limited to the UK. And again, there are multiple changes in references and terminology to change EU references to UK references. Powers of the European Commission are transferred to the Secretary of State, and the powers and functions of the European Chemicals Agency and other national competent authorities are transferred to the HSE or the Health and Safety Executive for Northern Ireland. So, under the Biocidal Products Regulation, there are basically two requirements. So, firstly, you have to seek authorization for active substances. So, the active substance is the actual active chemical within a product that kills the bugs, and you have to seek authorization for that. And you then have to seek approval for the biocidal product itself. So in this slide and the next slide, where you see me referring firstly to active substances and then products, and it's intentional, it's because they are two separate requirements. So firstly, the EU has an Article 95 list, which is all of the active substances that have been approved in the UK. The HSE will publish a UK list and a UK simplified list of active substances, which is in effect going to be the UK version of the Article 95 list. Any active substance that is on the EU's Article 95 list will initially also be copied across to the UK list, but it will be removed if the person who submitted the dossier is not established in the UK 2 years after exit day, or again 2 years after the end of the transition period. So if you are applying for product authorization in the future, that will, well, in fact, at the moment it already goes to the HSE, but it's then in effect recognized across the EU. In future, your application for product authorization will still go to the HSE or the Health and Safety Executive for Northern Ireland. What changes is that whereas currently, if you obtain product authorization from the HSE, that would then be mutually recognized across the EU after exit or after the end of the transition period. That authorization will no longer be recognized in other member states. Now, these particular regulations have multiple different amendments setting out transitional provisions relating to outstanding applications to the European Chemicals Agency. So in other words, this is where you've applied for product authorization and it hasn't yet been fully determined. I haven't set out the detail here because there's a lot of it. So if you have a product which has already been authorized by the HSE under the existing EU scheme, that authorization is automatically transferred to the UK scheme. So you won't need to reapply for authorization. However, just as with REACH, you may still be required to file certain information with the HSE if they request it. So products that have been authorized in other EU states will be recognized in the UK, provided that the authorization holder is registered in the UK within 12 months and provides information to the HSE within 60 days of request. So note there's a slight difference here compared to active substances in other member states. And one other change here is that whereas currently CLP has labelling requirements that obviously refer to European legislation, that reference within CLP will be changed to a reference to COSH. That doesn't mean that there's going to be any major changes in how you label the products. It's just a technical change. So what about other EU regulations? So I mentioned some other regulations, such as the Personal Protective Equipment Regulation, the regulation that applies to equipment that burns gaseous fuels, and the regulation that applies to construction products. So they are also copied onto the UK statute book, and they're also subject to a number of changes. But because these regulations relate to CE marking, the changes that apply here are the same changes as the ones that I described previously when I was looking at UK CE marking regulations. So if you want to know how they're affected, obviously go back to the previous slides about CE marking. And that's it. Thank you very much. So thank you for listening to this webinar. We'll stay online for about another 15 minutes. So if you have any further questions that you want to send through to us, please feel free to do so. If we can answer them online immediately, we'll do so. Any questions that we can't answer immediately, we will look up the answer and we will include that when we send out the link to the webinar and the slides. We'll also send out a feedback survey. We'd be very grateful if you take the time to complete that, because obviously anything that we can do to improve the service that we provide, including these webinars, is obviously something that we want to do. If you do have any questions or you're interested in any training, such as, for example, training on how to use legislation update service, or if you're interested in any of the other services that we provide, such as carrying out compliance audits or setting up aspects registers, or training on risk assessment and use of the risk assessment tool and so on, then please do either call us on the number that I put on the slide there, or send us an email on that link.